Hi everybody and welcome back to another video. So for anyone who's not aware, I just wrapped up a month of streaming Halloween themed games on my Twitch channel. For anyone that's not aware, I do stream on Twitch 3 days a week, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays starting at 7 Central. I'll have a link in the description if you want to come hang out. But I just wrapped up a month of streaming horror themed games, or really Halloween themed games, on the Twitch channel, and so I wanted to do a recap of the games that I played, talk about the ones that I really liked, and give some recommendations for people on games that they maybe haven't checked out yet or aren't aware of, so that either now, if that's what you're into, or next October, next sort of Halloween season, you'll have some recommendations. Alright, so why don't we just get right into it with the first game, which is Among the Sleep. So this is PS4, PC, it's on a bunch of different consoles, but Among the Sleep is a first-person horror game, which has kind of like the main narrative conceit. The main hook is that you play as a very small child, like 1 to 2 years old, a toddler who is able to walk but also crawls, and so everything you experience is through that lens. That means that the environments that you're crawling around in or moving around in are to scale from a child that would be that size. So, everyday objects are a lot larger than they otherwise would be, which is sort of a gimmick, I guess you could say. But I like when games do that. I don't know. The novelty of things being bigger than they should be is just never lost on me. I don't know if that means that I'm easy to entertain or what it means. But the actual story of the game involves the child that you play as kind of navigating between an actual house and real locations, and then sort of more fantastical. It's not super clear if they're imagined locations or if they really are, like, if you're really going through sort of portholes to other worlds or whatever it might be. Nothing too horribly scary, but they do have some pretty interesting environments. I'd say that's probably the strongest point of the game. It does some cool stuff with some of the locations, and it is, I don't know, it's fun enough. The story is not really, its story didn't grab me, I guess, and if I'm being honest, the scares are not super scary, so I would say go in with a mind to have some fun, but not necessarily to get scared. It's not the best horror game. It's not really one that I would strongly recommend, but if you're already interested in it, it's fun enough to check out and, give it a couple hours that it takes to play through. It's a very short game. Next up is one of my standouts for this October. I was really surprised at how much I ended up enjoying this game. That is Maid of Sker. So, Maid of Sker is another first-person horror game. It's probably going to be a theme that you'll see coming up here. And the game's mechanics are largely focused around sound. So sound is always a big deal in horror games, right? Effective sound design makes or breaks the tension in a game. But this one ramps it up by making the sounds that your characters make and the sounds of the enemies and things all directly mechanically important. So, you'll be sneaking around. You have a button for your character to hold their breath so that they aren't making extra noise to alert enemies. And if you do things like walk through a dusty area or walk near a fire and inhale smoke, your character will cough, which will alert nearby enemies. You can bump into shelves and knock over vases or picture frames. You can step on a creaky floorboard. There's just a lot of different ways to make noise. And the enemies are very sensitive to sound because they're basically all blind. So you will be able to get very close to an enemy without them actually seeing you, as long as you aren't making a sound, which adds, I think, a pretty neat sense of tension. I will say that the first hour of Maid of Sker was easily the scariest and probably some of the most tense I've had this Halloween. It's always kind of that fear of the unknown, right? As you're getting into the game, you don't fully know what to expect, and you don't know exactly what the threats are going to be, and so that's the scariest part. So I would say going in blind is really the way to go for this game. Just don't look anything up. If you're into first-person horror, if you like good, effective sound design, check out Maid of Sker. It definitely was scary, and it certainly kind of had me hooked narratively throughout, trying to make my way through to the end. Really a nice blend of like Amnesia meets Resident Evil. All right, next up, we are not going to choose a scary game, but it is Halloween appropriate, and that is Muppet Monster Adventure. So, for anyone that has not played this game, I know what you're thinking, a Muppets game? And to that I would say, open your mind. No, but Muppet Monster Adventure is a 3D platformer and plays very similarly to Spyro. It would be very hard to talk about this game without just kind of clearing the air and getting that out of the way. You enter into these different worlds, you navigate around and collect a lot of these different kind of tokens, and you're trying to basically collect enough of them to unlock the next world. So nothing that you haven't seen before in, a Mario game, Banjo-Kazooie, Spyro, whatever it might be. But it's got some very entertaining aspects to it. First off, the voice acting in this game is hilarious. I'm not crazy familiar with the Muppets world, but some of the characters are pretty funny. One in particular, which I don't even need to spoil it for you. If you play this game, you will know which one I'm talking about. Yeah, there's a lot of different worlds to explore. They're all themed around, spooky stuff, Halloween, things like that. And then in addition to the different Halloween-themed levels, there are also Halloween-themed transformations that you can use. These are very context-sensitive transformations, meaning that when you need to use them, it will prompt you to use them. You can't kind of freely use them whenever you want. But it's things like, transforming into kind of a Frankenstein or into a bat or any number of different Halloween Universal Monster themed transformations to navigate around the levels. Really big, open, cool levels. Some really interesting music, kind of like this jazzy, jaunty soundtrack. And it's just, I don't know, it's a really good platformer that has definitely flown under the radar for people. So I would say check it out if you can. It's not super, super cheap. But if you're in the mood for something that is Halloween themed, but you don't want to play a horror game, I would actually really recommend Muppet Monster Adventure. I had a blast with it. My chat was loving it. It was just a really good time. All right, next up is the only game that we played that I don't have a physical copy to show you, but that is the sequel to Amnesia, Amnesia Rebirth. Amnesia Rebirth is the sequel to Amnesia Dark Descent, which is one of my all-time favorite horror games. And so the question kind of becomes, does this live up to Dark Descent? And I would say in a lot of ways, yes, but then in a lot of ways, it's doing its own thing. So this game, right away, you start out, there's a plane crash and you get launched out into the desert, which immediately kind of set up alarm bells for me or just kind of threw me off because it's like, Amnesia was a game so focused on darkness, and here they are throwing you into the bright, sunny desert. There's even like a mechanic around not staying out in the sun for too long, otherwise you'll start to take damage. And so I wasn't sure what to expect right away. You do eventually start to descend into some caves and then to many other locations, and the same kind of core theme of light being relevant comes back from the original Dark Descent. So you will scavenge to find matches or oil for a lantern that you will obtain and use that to light up the dark environments. And just like in the original Amnesia, your character is affected by staying in the dark for too long or seeing scary things in the game, essentially. Anything that would be stressful to the character stresses kind of their mental health meter, if you will. Very scary game, very effective with like stringing the tension along just long enough for you to be unsure when the next scare is going to come. Not super jump scare heavy, but it is a tense game. Where it varies from the first Amnesia, though, is this game has a much more complicated, much more robust story, which I think will be for some people and not for others. It's kind of your mileage may vary situation. But, you go to some pretty wild locations, and it has a lot of different characters to follow and some different story threads to understand. And if you're not really paying attention, you can kind of lose the plot a little bit. You'll still be pulled along by seeing the next location and things like that. but it's not like the Dark Descent was, where there's this one very straightforward story that you're following through. There are like little side stories and things that you will see in Amnesia Rebirth. Overall, though, I do think that it is a great entry in the Amnesia series. It is my second favorite now after Dark Descent. And yeah, Frictional Games has just kind of done it again. I think it was really cool. I'd be curious to hear what others thought of this game, because I do think it has the potential to be a little polarizing. But just like the first one, super scary, super fun, and just a good time. All right, 2 games left here. Next one is Dementium The Ward. So I just recently got the ability to capture video for my DS and 3DS, which was great because it means that I was finally able to play through this game live on the stream. The Dementium the games, for anyone that aren't familiar with them, were developed by Renegade Kid. One of the main developers was Jules Watsham, who is now moved on to Atui. He did other things like Zeo Drifter, Mutant Muds, things like that. But they did Dementium and Dementium 2 and Moon on the DS, all of which are first-person shooters / exploration games. And it is just kind of mind-blowing how well it runs on the DS. I mean, playing a first-person shooter in 60 FPS on a DS is something that you just don't feel like should work, but it plays really well. You start out, you're in kind of a Silent Hill style hospital that is run down and something has gone wrong. You very quickly find a flashlight and then some weapons, and you are trying to navigate through, understand what's happening, and escape, basically. The gameplay is relatively simple. I mean, the fights are not particularly complicated. An enemy will run at you, and you'll be able to very quickly dispatch of them. And there's not a lot of options in terms of like quick maneuverability and things like that. But the game is also very generous with health items because they know that that's not the case, I think. And so you very rarely will be without full health for very long. It's almost like you get 1 health item per encounter, basically. And that's not entirely consistent with the whole game, but it is true, at least for the first chunk of the game. It's just a fully featured game, right? It has a ton of different levels. It's like 16 chapters long. There's like 4 or 5 boss fights. And while it's not going to obviously scare you too much, I mean, it is very low res, and it is on a DS screen. I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but I don't get too scared playing things on a handheld. But more than anything, it's just impressive. I think it is a really big testament to how talented that development studio was to make a first-person game run so well on the DS. So I absolutely would recommend Dementium to anyone. It is a fun horror game, and it is kind of just like a technical feat. I will say, I believe there's a Dementium remastered that came out in the 3DS eShop. I didn't play the remastered one because I had the copy of the original, and I wanted to kind of see the experience of the original before checking out remastered, although it's one that I would be open to trying in the future, probably after I've played through Dementium 2. All right, the last game we have here is Layers of Fear. So, not to sound like a broken record, but Layers of Fear is a first-person exploration-based horror game. There's kind of a trend there. I think that's because those are the horror games that jump out at me. Amnesia has been one of my favorite horror games for a long time, Amnesia The Dark Descent. And so I'm always kind of chasing that feeling. I mean, I do love other games, Silent Hill, Resident Evil, things like that, but first person I think is effective for horror. But Layers of Fear it's all about you take control of a painter who is kind of trying to complete their magnum opus, right? They're trying to recapture the art that made them popular and trying to kind of work on their masterpiece and go out with a bang, so to speak. But what Layers of Fear does is it's all about that painter's psychological deterioration, basically. And so it manipulates the environments, and none of the locations, objects, anything are reliable. You'll walk down a hallway, you'll open a door, the door will be a dead end, you'll turn around, and there'll be no door where you just walked in. Or you'll look at an object, and then you'll look the other way, and that same object will be there. The game really messes with you by manipulating things, surprising you. and kind of just being trippy. There are many scenes where you are trying to figure out where to go, and every door will be blocked, or you'll open it up and there'll be something scary there, and you'll end up having to kind of like backtrack, but where you backtrack is a totally new location now. A little hard to explain, but basically the idea being that you aren't just exploring a static location, you're exploring sort of this ever-changing Hogwartsy style labyrinth house of the mind. It has a lot of, I think, pretty effective jump scares. If you're the type of person that doesn't like jump scares, the tension building is good, but what it really does is surprise you in a lot of different ways. It's very good about turning around and like throwing something at you, or a bunch of books falling off of a shelf, or there's 100 different ways that the game thinks to surprise you as the player, but they are all kind of in the theme of jump scares. It has a pretty interesting story. The environments are fun to explore. It's a very pretty game, and it is very, very tense. Mostly because you're waiting for the next jump scare. As you play along, or as I played it, I started to, towards the end, get a little less scared, just because I do think you build a tolerance for jump scares the more that they happen, which is probably why they're not like a reliable long-term source of horror. But for a game that's 2.5, 3 hours long, you can beat it in one sitting. It's a really good pick up and play horror game that does some really cool things that I think are worth seeing. I was surprised by how much I ended up enjoying it. Layers of Fear is very cool. I should also add that we did, in addition to the main game, play through the Inheritance DLC for Layers of Fear, where you control the main character's daughter as she kind of returns to the house many years later, which is cool because you get to see new locations that were in the first game in a new way, manipulated. You get some backstory on the family, and it does kind of flesh out the world a little bit. Not as scary as the main game, but still very worth it if you get the Masterpiece Edition, or if you can get the DLC for cheap. Yeah, so that concludes the horror games that I was able to beat this October. I do always like to play horror-themed stuff in October, and the stream has been a great way for me to play more games and more consistently play them. So, like I mentioned at the top, I do stream every Tuesday, Thursday, Friday at 7 Central. The link is in the description. It would be awesome if you come pop in, say hi, let me know what horror games you've been playing, or if you have any horror recommendations for next year. This will certainly be a tradition where in October we are playing horror-themed stuff. But other than that, I do appreciate you taking the time. I hope that you got some cool recommendations or learned a little bit more about games you weren't really aware of. And if not, I will just catch you in the next video. Thanks.